Yeah, and I think part of the, what I want to kind of touch on this episode, and we've discussed it in previous interviews, is just kind of how radio can be successful in integrating other aspects of audio and like video, social media, that sort of thing. And so I think that this one isn't necessarily all about like radio specifically, but just like
Media in general?
yeah, almost.
Okay.
I mean, it's definitely with a radio focus, but it's
Yeah.
it's kind of how everything can benefit or help radio, almost, if that makes sense.
All right. Well, just, ask your questions and I'll answer.
All right. So, how about you do your introduction real quick?
Okay. My name's Tom Wassell. I am a 15-year, I suppose, veteran of the sports media industry. I worked at ESPN Radio Network in Bristol, Connecticut for 5 years. 5 years to the day, actually. Like on the day they handed me my 5-year pin. Like, congratulations, you worked here for 5 years. I'm talking literally in the exchange where my boss gave me the pin, I handed him my credentials and walked out the door. That was my last day because I took a different job here in Seattle to come out here and produce the Brock and Salk show. Brock Hewitt and Mike Salk, they're two local hosts here in Seattle sports radio. It was called 710 ESPN Seattle then. I think recently they've rebranded it to Seattle Sports or something like that. But I worked there from 2011 to 2021, first as a producer, and then from 2012-ish to through the rest of it, I was a host. Did first nights, and then from 2015 to 2021, I was hosting from noon to 3 every day. I hosted the Seattle Mariners pre- and post-game show, and other sorts, various slots here and there. We did all kinds of like specialty programming too. But I mean, that's the shortest version of it. But let's just say this definitively. I was always a content person, in the studio person. I was never an exec, never had any aspirations to be an exec, program director, that kind of thing. I was always and will always be a content guy.
Yeah, so we've talked about in previous episodes the history about radio, how it started, how it continued to grow, and how it's evolved over the years. So I think that you can provide some special insight about the future of radio. Obviously, someone who has been removed from radio a little bit, you have a different perspective than other guests that we've had on the show so far. So, how do you think that mobile devices have had an impact on the radio?
I think the instinct at first was, and when I say at first, I'm talking in the years 08, 9, 10, around there, when smartphones first became a thing and then became, like an appendage after that. I think around that time, people were getting nervous that we wouldn't be able to account for the traffic or track the ratings, measure them from people who were listening to content on the phone as opposed to traditional terrestrial radio. It would almost be like, we got 1 million listeners, but there's only 10 people listening on the radio, and that's why we're getting destroyed in the ratings. But eventually they did correct that. Here's the funny part, though. It was never, I don't want to say never, but for about 5 or 6 years, it wasn't clearly explained to me how exactly we were tracking the mobile devices. So it was always, for a long time, you'd go on the radio and, it's not like you only do radio for ratings, but you didn't have a firm grasp of how you were being evaluated or by whom. So there's this mechanism, I don't know if you know about it. It's called the PPM, the personal people meter, it's like a little device that they started using around 2008 that people would wear, as opposed to sending out the old Nielsen diaries to the mail where people would just write down what they listened to for the month, as if you can remember that. It was a horrible rating system. But this thing, it automatically tracked whatever you listened to. Now, you'd think that's good. The question was, what's the sample size that they hand out? Are there 10 devices in town? Are there 1,000? Are there 10,000? And nobody ever really seemed to know, or if they did, you didn't get a straight answer. Now, I've heard at first I heard 8, like that was the sample size in a major city. I was like, that can't be right. But then later on, I heard it was like 1,500 or something. So it's like, okay, do we just get more out there? I don't know. So to answer your question, how did mobile devices, and even if you want to expand out to, like smart speakers and things like that, I believe now they're all fitted with the proper, we'll say, encoding to measure listenership. So now I think the industry is, I'll say, relatively comfortable, at least insofar as they're tracking representative data. But for most of my career, so I got to ESPN in 2006, and at first that wasn't really an issue, but within 2 years it was. And so I'd say even for most of my career, I operated in a space where things were very uncertain in that regard. But now they seem to have figured it out. But, most people are listening on their phone. The only time anybody is ever listening on the radio, like with an antenna, is in their car. I don't know anybody who flips a radio on in their house.
Yeah, so I found an interesting statistic. The Infinite Dial did a study that showed there was a steady increase in the number of people who were listening to online audio weekly from 17% in 2009 all the way up to 60% in 2019. So I think that, the research shows that there's definitely been a shift, like you mentioned, from people who are listening just to dial up, FM radio to now listening on smart speakers, on mobile devices, laptops, etc. And so with that being the change of radio listenership, there's obviously been a change and an evolution of technology as well. So we've seen, obviously, podcasts become a thing. You mentioned how, there's internet shows now. There's Twitch, which is a live streaming platform. There's all these different platforms that you can host. What is podcasting? How does it compare to traditional radio?
Okay. Let me just say what I don't want to do. I don't want to set up a comparison necessarily that says, well, podcasting's the future, radio's dead, because that is a thought that's out there and a significant one, unfortunately. The format, it would be like comparing Top 40 to sports talk radio, right? It's a completely different experience. Now, for the consumer, it's still just a person or persons listening to other persons, right? But, podcasting, for one thing, you don't really have any commercials. Yes, the host will do like a live read for a minute or something like that. There are ways around that, but you don't have to worry about that. I mean, in traditional radio, you're breaking probably 3 to 4 times an hour for 8 minutes at a time, 7, 8 minutes at a time. That right there is probably the biggest difference. And it's an inconvenience, and always has been, to the listener, just, for 80 years or whatever it was. We just kind of got used to that. Podcasting comes out, A, no commercials. B, anybody can do it. Anybody can do it, obviously. Now, anybody can start it. Not everybody can sustain it. In radio, most people who are employed as a host don't just start their shows and do them for a month or two and then are out the door. A lot of podcasts go that way. But I would, my thought on it is, for long form content, like the area I came from in sports talk radio, for that kind of subject matter, podcasting works extremely well. You can stretch out, you can have a conversation. In radio, there's so many principles of formatics that hosts concern themselves with. Make sure when you come out of break, you get right to the point. And, we're not losing listenership, and we want to play this audio, and we got to make sure we do this. And you got to have facts to back up your opinion, and it's got to be laid out on there's just all this stuff that you're told in a lot of cases by people who have never even hosted radio. Okay. That's the culture of terrestrial radio. You're going to get a lot of interference. We'll say from above, from below, your producer, the side, even the side, your co-host. And with podcasting, the adventure of that, the spirit of that sort of open-endedness of it, I think in and of itself is appealing to the listener or the viewer, because it's just a person or persons who are talking and they're just going. Often, now, sometimes the trade-off is that, the people who are talking are just people. They're not, they don't have any kind of insight to offer. They're not tied to the industry. Now, so in some cases they are. I mean, everybody who works at ESPN has their own podcast now. You know what I mean? What's happened is, if you worked in radio before, or TV, really. In fact, if you worked at TV before, chances are, in sports anyway, you were doing some radio. But it's kind of forced everybody into double and triple duty. Because if you have a radio show and it's podcasted, meaning like you just record the radio show, edit out the commercials and post them online, people can get it that way. Okay, that's fine. But oftentimes there's now in radio, there's an expectation that you'll have a separate podcast in addition to your radio show. Or if you're, you host a TV show, you host, ESPN NFL show or something. Be sure to check out the podcast. Comes out every week. It's like there was this expectation that was suddenly added to everybody's job. It's, oh yeah, by the way, just this little thing. You're going to host this other show. It's like, what? And by the way, it's going to be an hour long. You're just going to talk. Like, okay. So the podcasting end of it in what I'll call traditional media kind of got tacked on, and not everybody is great at that. I feel like the people who are great at podcasting are people who are not from that world. They're people who are totally disassociated from it because their thinking has not yet been contaminated by it. Because in my mind, there are two separate worlds that do the same thing, but by different people and with very different intentions. So when you get people from the other world coming into the podcast world thinking they can do it, they're just sort of doing it. I don't think many are particularly good at it.
So what I'm basically hearing is like the future of radio isn't necessarily, like, radio is not going to die out, but it's kind of changing forms, integrating other media into it, including podcasting. So that way it's more of a multimedia, how do I say that?
Extravaganza. Well, here's the thing. Are you asking me what future does radio have? At the moment, media companies are never concerned about what their product is because of the rate of technological development just in the world. They're concerned about what their company is going to be. The reason why I use the word concerned is because they don't know ever. They don't know 3 years from now. They don't know 4 years from. They just don't know. So it feels like it's heading in a direction where, yes, a radio station still has an antenna that it uses to service the public up on a mountain somewhere. But the thinking in the business is we're going wherever everybody else is going. So for a while in the mid-teens, I guess, 14, 15, 16, the president of our company would say repeatedly, he would say that he had this mantra, he would say, digital is not optional. Digital is not optional, meaning you're a radio host, but you must contribute digital content in a significant way, meaning online print, we'll say, so writing. And in addition to what I just talked about, having some kind of spoken word presence in digital form. So if the landscape merges podcasting with radio and TV and, 10, 15 years from now, it all just kind of becomes one, well, then I guess that answers the question in some way. It means that radio not only has a dubious future, but so does potentially even the current podcasting industry. Because anytime things merge, people on all sides get cut out potentially. So you can't just expect some of these media companies like Hubbard or Cumulus or iHeart to just go away. They're not going to say, well, YouTube just, outplayed us and that's it. They're going to be involved somehow. The question is, will there be a such thing as a live radio host, or will they just have a select group of people taping shows and posting them online? Because if online is the game, then to me, anything other than that is superfluous. So the radio itself, you might have, you might not, but that's not going to determine necessarily whether or not there's a such thing as radio content. It's just going to live elsewhere. But how they handle that in terms of staffing, producers, how they sell the advertising, all of that is yet to be determined.
What was that phrase again that you mentioned?
Oh, digital is not. He actually screwed it up at first when he admitted.
Yeah.
He said digital is not an option, which made it look like, wait, we're not doing digital? No, what he meant was digital is not optional. You have to.
Okay.
And it was understandable. It made sense.
So building on the idea of digital is not optional, it's no question that in today's media, that social media is so important for really all forms of media. What importance does a social media presence have for radio stations and just for the future of audio in general?
It's everything. Again, though, let's be precise about which aspect of audio content we're talking about. I was in a personality-based realm of radio. It was, the show had my name on it. It had my co-host name on it. Yeah, we talked about local sports content, the Seattle Seahawks, Mariners, etc., as well as national stuff. But we weren't the Seahawks gang in the morning or something. It was Bob, Graz, and Tom, or Tom, Jake, and Stacy, the other show I did. And it was personality driven, meaning the local team was the point of entry for the audience, but the reason why you stay and keep listening was for us. Because you can, especially now, you can get Seahawks or any football team, baseball team, you can get that stuff anywhere, a million different places. It's just a question of how you prefer to consume it and from whom. And so for the personality-based shows, having a Twitter presence, it got to a point very quickly. I was one of the last people at my station anyway to get on Twitter. The only reason I know this is because on your Twitter thing, it says joined, and then it gives the month and the year. Mine was January 2012. By 2013, maybe even late 2012, if you didn't have a strong social media presence or you weren't on there at all, you weren't doing your job. Not just because you can further the conversation from your show on Twitter, right, by just engaging your audience, but that's where you're getting all your news. That's where it's, like I said before, online's the game. Like Twitter's the game. That's where all, the information. Sports radio is a read and react business, as is news radio, really, for the most part. And if you're not on Twitter, where are you consuming your news? You know what I mean? Like it's coming down, boom, boom, boom. And after a while, like it does come down fast, but after a while, your mind sort of gets trained as to how to consume it and what to filter out. And, you know the rate at which either news is breaking or people are saying this or that, or you're just observing conversation. Sports radio is just that. It's a conversation between two people or it's a monologue, maybe with callers or something like that. And so is Twitter. What you end up having is conversations that are influenced by other conversations that you're either hearing or seeing on social media. It's all of that. It's certainly multidimensional, but I actually am not the biggest fan fundamentally of what social media has done to our culture. I think in some ways it's really perverted it. But at the same time, from a conversation stimulating standpoint, it's done wonders because people who would, 10, 15 years ago would have never participated in anything happening outside of their own sphere are now like immersed. And that has definitely helped the content industry in general, right? Just look at what's going on in politics. All of a sudden, everybody's an expert. It's like, well, who's to say that you're not an expert, right? All of a sudden, you never know what you don't know until you dive in. Well, that's what's happened with a lot of the radio content, podcasting content, because the assumption now is that everybody, when I say everybody, I mean generally that, like everybody. I don't mean just when I say people who count. I don't mean like the elites. I mean people who are going to listen to you. They're online seeing all the same stuff and reacting to all the same stuff you are. So if you're deliberately avoiding that, then what are you really doing here? Like, if you're the one who's supposed to be leading the conversation and everybody else knows more about what's going on than you do, then you have to start, questioning yourself. So social media, whether you're an information broker, reporter, with your own platform, or you're following what's going on to know what to look for and report on, or you're a personality, like, doesn't matter. It's all there. That's the world. That's why this whole thing with Twitter censorship and Elon Musk buying it and opening the thing back up to everybody is so critical. That is the world. That is the place from which all content, I don't say emerges, but is curated. Okay, that's where it's all being reacted to. And to start cutting people out, I think is ludicrous. But if you're not on there, you're not in the game. You're not.
Yeah, I think whether you like it or not, like social media is becoming an essential part of really any kind of media, including radio, including podcasting, including all these different forms. So what impact do you think that TikTok has on radio and just on the music industry?
Okay, I actually don't think that it has much of one. Just from what I can tell so far, it's funny how each platform, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, they seem to have their own area that are they're different like subcategories within the online content world. Because TikTok is very short videos with people just goofing off. That, to me, I don't see much in the way of editorial content that's more than 10 seconds. That's an area that radio is never gonna or should never, try to compete. That would be insane for them to do that. Again, like I've not, how do I say this without sounding like snobbish? I've never seen one TikTok video that is in any way meant to be like intellectually serious. Even if it is a serious person making, we'll say, an editorial sort of comment on something, there's still an element of like, hey, this is TikTok. It's just screw around time. Now, Facebook, that's, hey, I went on a trip with my family somewhere. Check out my pictures. LinkedIn is employment. Instagram is that. Instagram seems to have more to do with somebody's, say, personal business type stuff. Like my mom, she does a lot of interior design, decorative type stuff, and she posts a lot of her work, and that's kind of a hub for what she does there. As far, you asked me about radio and music, I come from the sports media world, but music, because I'm now in the music thing. I mean, I've got, albums up on Spotify and iTunes and all this stuff. That is a Byzantine world, okay? I have no clue how that's, I know how it's tracked. It's by listenership, but like I see my breakdown of money earned. It's not even pennies. It's like fractions of pennies on the dollar. And I would say, if anything, how TikTok is going to change it, I have no idea. Because I don't think it's the people who are in these industries you're talking about, whether it's radio or music, that are going to be good at that stuff. I think that they're just going to be there because they need to say they're there, right? Because if you don't have a presence, you look like a dinosaur. So they're there, but they're not the ones who are leading the way. They're the ones who are going to be following. So what it means for music, I don't know. Probably just that they have to do this one extra thing. But what it could do, this could happen. It could affect, for example, songwriting in the way that it's like, oh, okay, musicians start saying to themselves, in the early 80s, all right, well, MTV, that's the future, right? So now we got to start making videos to accompany the songs we're writing. And so now the music industry is going to choose mostly good-looking guys and girls to put on TV, as opposed to the guys from, Lynyrd Skynyrd with their beards and hats and whatnot, and, ripped jeans. Now in TikTok, musicians might start saying, all right, I need to start writing music and looking like a person who can sort of accommodate this medium. And so, how that might look, I have no idea. But it's never out of the realm of possibility that musicians start, tailoring what they do to some of these other platforms.
An era where we see tons of different technology being developed every day and all these different media platforms and everything. You see a lot of different things go extinct and they, just kind of disappear and they're not really relevant anymore. How do you think that radio avoids becoming extinct?
Terrestrial radio or the people on the radio or media companies? Because the only, I'm not trying to complicate the question, but unfortunately it is that complicated because, like I said before, the people who you hear in one place, depending on how the evolution goes, the media company may move them elsewhere because the media company has decided to get out of the X business and go into the Y business. I would think they would make that transition slowly. Maybe that transition is happening already. Like maybe that's what I'm talking about. That's been taking place through for the duration of my career. So, I mean, one scenario, I suppose, is that, like I said, with this sort of merging of all platforms, you could see a scenario where entertainment separates itself from news, where, like I said, the TikTok thing is, some guy jumping off his roof onto a trampoline and landing in the other guy's yard. It's like, that's not for the person who's consuming, or excuse me, that's not going to compete with news consumption, I hope. But I mean, think about it. YouTube has already aggregated so much diversity of content. YouTube is like the world's television station and radio station, all rolled up into one. It's just a question of what you're looking for in a given moment. So it almost seems like all roads lead to that. If you had a podcast or you're a radio station and you're saying, yeah, find our content at www.whatever, but you're not putting your stuff on YouTube, you're making a mistake because you're in that sense, you're only talking to the people who already listen to you. What about the people who just do a search for, like in my case, say it where they do a search for Seattle Seahawks commentary or something? If I were on YouTube, my name would come up. But if I were only on my, my own website or something like that, or only on terrestrial radio, then, I mean, I can't help but think that those businesses, not that they're going to die off overnight, but they're at a disadvantage. And if you're at a disadvantage, I mean, what are we supposed to say? So There are other factors where you could come back at me and say, well, YouTube, though, they were great, but they're starting to do this and that. And they might be sabotaging their own efforts. So you never know, somebody else might come in. That's true. That's always a possibility. But for now, it seems like you've got one massive channel and a lot of different like sub channels within it. Like before, there's the internet, and then you go on Google and you can just do a search, and then you end up wherever you end up. More and more, it seems like it's just YouTube. I mean, I don't really go to that many websites anymore other than that. You know what I mean? Unless I'm looking for something specific. But if I'm just, jerking around on there, that's where I'm going. So if you don't have some kind of presence like that, assuming YouTube itself doesn't change, that's where it's at. But a question to ask in addition to what you're asking is, what's the future of a platform like that? And, will other either industries or creators or whatever, how will they react to that? Because that's the answer to your question, as far as I can tell.
So concerning other medias that you think, or other platforms that you think radio should kind of embrace, you mentioned YouTube, you mentioned social media and podcasting. What are some other modern technologies do you think that radio stations should embrace or integrate in order to sustain themselves in the future?
Other technologies? I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is, because I don't know what technology is emerging. I don't know what technology exists, like practically speaking, that radio is not embracing. Like that, in some cases, they've been slow to embrace certain technology, but not because they were oblivious. Radio's problem, and TV's problem for that matter, to a lesser extent, but it's still there, is that they don't know how to use the technology that's there. Okay. When I see these documentaries that are put together by, say, one or two people with Avid or some graphics video app that you can just, anybody can get and put together, that's, well thought out, well researched, and just artistically, looks good. The constraints that person does not have is what allows it to thrive. A corporate media sponsored, show is going to have content that is always, it's too restricted by rules and regulations and, too many cooks in the kitchen, that kind of thing. And the content that comes out is bland. That's the crux of it, okay? Because, you're asking me all these questions that are sort of driving at one thing. Can radio sustain itself? Can it do it, right? And technologically, is that a problem? It's like, probably not, because these companies have money. They've got that on their side. So whatever technology is available, they'll make themselves present if they want to make themselves present, as long as they don't bail out completely and go, do something else. The question is, can they be good at it? In my opinion, ESPN, the company that really pioneered sports media. Now, I'm not talking game broadcasts. I'm talking like, the ancillary conversation around it. They invented that. And for about 15 years, 20 years, they were tremendous at it. I can't think of one radio show or a podcast that I enjoy or that I would even consider consuming if it, unless it were the only thing available. Because there's a mindset that each one of those, I'll say creators, hosts, whatever, have that is more tailored to a sort of button-down, treetop sort of view. Podcasting works really well for people who have an interest in like a niche sort of topic. You could say, hey, what's your podcast about? You could just say, oh, it's about baseball. Or you could say it's about this very specific statistic, right, within baseball that some people are going to be interested in. And then it kind of develops out. But the people who work in these sort of more mainstream traditional avenues, to be great at independent content creation, you really got to be a creative, adventurous person who's willing to take risks. And established media, taking risks is antithetical to what they do. So what's going to kill them, if anything, I'm not saying that they will be killed, but if it happens, it's going to be because, it won't be because the technology wasn't embraced. They'll do that. It'll be because they embrace a technology that they have no idea what to do with. The best bet they have, like a company like ESPN or Disney for that matter. Now, look, Disney, the thing that runs out of Florida, that's a different operation. They're always going to be fine in media because that's what they do, creative things, right? They create that kind of stuff. But ESPN is a bunch of people talking about sports, just people. It's not that complicated. Radio, a disc jockey from 20 years ago. I mean, looking back, I was never one, and I don't mean any disrespect, but geez, you sit there at the turntable. Hey, here's the newest one from Pink Floyd, another one breaking the wall, and you play it. Like, that's what you do? And maybe you make some local appearances at, bars or something like that. But, all of a sudden you're asked to create, say, an hour-long show, whether it's just you talking or it's, a documentary or it's this or that. You got to really be, originality is just paramount. It's paramount. And this other stuff people have seen. They've seen SportsCenter. They've seen, the ABC World News or whatever it is, Fox News. I'm not saying there aren't people within that area that can't do that. They can, some, but not most. So that will be what kills their product, is that the general public will look at them and say, I don't want to watch this. I've seen this a million times. It's fake. It's not interesting. And this other thing over here is, so I'm going to watch that.
All right. And this next question, I guess it's a little awkward because you don't currently work in radio, but I'll go ahead and ask the question.
Well, it hasn't been that long, so yeah.
What made you originally love radio? Like, what made you want to go into it in the first place?
Well, I never really did love radio as a communicative platform, but so like I said, I am a musician, but I always have been. So around the time I was like in and just out of college, like early 2000s, I was doing that mainly. And somewhere in there, I started listening to sports talk radio. Okay. Like call-in shows, that kind of thing. It just seemed fun. It really seemed fun. And what was surprising to me is that I don't say I'd call it a cash cow, but they generated enough money as to employ an entire industry of people across the country. I mean, in every major city in America, you've got at least one, if not two sports radio stations, competing with one another, covering something. And, there you have probably about, I'll say 8 hosts, maybe 2 hosts a show, 4 producers, ad execs. So this was a thriving industry. It wasn't just like something, that I discovered in one place. It was like a big, big deal. And I just thought to myself, well, I could be in this. I didn't know I could be a host. In fact, I didn't know I wanted to be a host until I was one. And I didn't know what a producer did then. But as I began to look into it a little bit, long story short, I ended up in 2005 at it's called the Connecticut School of Broadcasting. It's like a several month seminar type thing with people who are in the industry kind of as instructors. And in my case, I got plugged in. That's how I got plugged into ESPN radio. One of my instructors was a program director there. If I hadn't had that, I don't know if I ever would have got in at all. But I got in, at the lowest level and was cutting highlights at 3 o'clock in the morning. And then I became a producer and blah, 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 kept going. But, what made me want to get into it is just that I'm a creative conversational idea guy. So that area of radio, again, radio happened to be the platform that was housing this thing that I was interested in. And so if I wanted to be in it, then radio was going to have to be something that I was going to have to be like, well acquainted with. But as far as, it's interesting you asked that question because when I first got to ESPN, we had meetings and like little sort of social events, icebreaker type stuff to, get everybody introduced to one another once in a while, influx of new people. You always hear people say like, oh yeah, well, my dad worked at W whatever and at Hofstra University and I always wanted to be in radio. And I was like the only person who said, well, I don't have any relatives working in radio. I just wanted to do this. I would imagine that by now, 15 years later, that's changed a little bit. Because the people who are getting into any area of content creation now, A, they don't really have any sort of lineage in that business. And B, I found in a lot of cases, even the people in sports, like they didn't start watching this stuff until like maybe 2 years ago. But I'll say my generation, people who are in their like early 40s. If you didn't watch sports like your whole life, and I'm not saying you got to be diehard fantasy sports guy or something, but you got to have enough background to be able to talk about this stuff for hours at a time. If you weren't that, then you weren't getting in it. But now it seems like everybody and anybody is getting into it and everything is acceptable. And so in that way, it's kind of been democratized. But don't think of radio as, well, if you're a host, if you're an ad exec, you might think of radio this way because you're selling everything. But if you're a host, I wouldn't think of radio as the industry I work in. I would think of it as a content industry because that's the real change. Whether you like it or not, you are in some way in competition with, Joe Schmo who's just doing his show on YouTube because Joe Schmo might be pretty good at it, and he might be better at this one thing than you are, but you might be better at a lot of things than he is, but you're still in competition with him. So those are the ways in which it's evolving as far as, what exists and what doesn't. I'm talking about just the way it affects everybody's mindset. Radio is just, it's a mechanism. It's the road you're on. It's not your vacation. It's just the road you're taking to your vacation.
All right. Well, that is all that I had for you. Thanks for coming on and doing this interview with me.
No problem.